It's the summer of 1958, and the young monarch Elizabeth II has been removed from London as the violence had become uncontrollable. In seclusion in Scotland, news from the south is disquieting in the extreme. The black-shirted thugs of the English socialists, the Engsocks as their detractors name them, have apparently broken into the empty Buckingham Palace. Priceless artifacts, rich artwork, and cherished memories all now hang in rags, the results of their barbarism beamed into households throughout the world. Similar scenes had played out in the capture of the Palace of Westminster. Now the black, red and white flag of the revolutionaries proudly flew over both Big Ben and the palace. In the far-off distance, Elizabeth hears a shriek, then some muted shouting, and then approaching engines. Would over 1,000 years of monarchy end this very night? So did George Orwell envisage such a scene when piecing together his law history of 1984? Well, while we don't have a definite answer, fear not, as we can at least piece together a plausible outcome or possibilities for Her Majesty when the party finally seized power. You'll be totally unshocked to learn that nothing good could have come from the party's rise for the young Queen. Working our way back from the 9 3-year plans referred to in the novel brings us to the year of 1958, just 6 years into her reign. Assuming, of course, history largely played out the same, and Elizabeth succeeded her father in 1952, what are the options for Airstrip 1's former sovereign? Well, while the party did sweep into power for an anti-capitalist revolution, and Winston does recall confused fighting in the streets of London when he was a child, the details of exactly how the party itself rose are murky. We know from the law that the early party premised its revolution on socialist principles, and that the ideology is inherently anti-monarchical. However, this does not necessarily mean that Elizabeth or her family is in immediate danger. Firstly, I believe that the revolution itself almost certainly began in the United States. Goldstein's book explains that Oceania itself formed from the absorption of the British Empire into the United States, implying, as is historically plausible, that Great Britain was the junior partner in this amalgamation. If this union occurred and then the revolution occurred, then perhaps the monarchy may have been already abolished. Though even so, the danger to the former monarch would still be very real, for reasons we'll get to soon. If Oceania emerged as a result of the revolution, then perhaps pro-Ingsoc pressures within Britain forced a union. In either scenario, English socialism takes hold in the United States, and Britain itself later becomes Airstrip 1, not exactly a flattering name that screams prestige or primacy. While I acknowledge that by Winston's time all provinces of Oceania are in theory equal, this doesn't mean that it was so at the party's initial rise. It may have taken some time for this system to be thought up or implemented. My point then is that if the revolution took time to take hold within the United States and perhaps begin spreading through popular support and military conquest both north and south, the Queen could have found herself at the centre of her increasingly shrinking empire in the interim. We know fighting occurred according to Winston, and that after a long period of peace, there had also been a major war in which Colchester had been nuked. Given the capital's proximity and the violence on the streets, I believe that if Canada had already fallen, that Scotland may have been a safe haven for a time. Given the power and military presence of the United States following the Second World War, and its theorized quick conquest or absorption of Canada and then Mexico and so forth southwards, I believe that Australia, New Zealand and South Africa may have also been decent targets, but could also have fallen for a mix of political pressure, internal pro-revolutionary unrest, and perhaps invasions. If so, and given the distance and danger to the Queen of travelling so far to these places, I personally think it unlikely Elizabeth and her family fled to any of these places. Sadly, for the reigning or former monarch, it doesn't make much difference in either scenario really. Her options are dire. So however it happens then, what becomes of Liz and her brood? Well, instinctively, I'd say that they are very high on the party's list for capture, trial, and execution, though I do think there is historical precedent to suggest that she may yet have had a role to play in the early era of the party. That the party was anti-monarchist is true. Winston reads in the child's history book how the party regarded the king as the chief of all the capitalists, and so it seems a special disdain would be reserved for Elizabeth, perhaps renamed Comrade Windsor upon capture to make a point. The possibility does occur to me, however, that given we know 1984 was partially based on Orwell's knowledge of both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, perhaps he had a similar fate in mind for Elizabeth that befell her relative, Tsar Nicholas II, in our reality's Russian Revolution. Nicholas, of course, was not overthrown and killed straight off. In fact, the Romanov monarch abdicated, even doing so initially in favour of his brother, who wisely refused the throne, but he did live on after the revolution until 1918. Perhaps Elizabeth too could play a role in the transition. Though anti-capitalist and monarchical, this doesn't mean that the party was stupid or blind to the political clout and legitimacy that could come from Elizabeth's own abdication. Perhaps she too could be forced to abdicate and give an address, either before or after a stay in an early version of the Ministry of Love. Depending on exactly how the party gained control in Britain, it may also have been useful to have her officially dissolve Parliament, though from Winston's description, it may be the case that little remained of the figures and infrastructure of the old political system and class. Why exactly would the party go to all this trouble? Well, remember we're talking about the early party. They violently seized the capital and perhaps most, if not all, of the country, but there must have been a few tense months when resistance still blazed in some areas. With the Queen or former Queen in their control, it strikes me that any politician worth their salt, even ingsoc ones, would see the temporary value in keeping such an influential figure alive. The propaganda value alone would be huge. The people in the newly dubbed Airstrip 1 would see an official surrender, perhaps an official and legitimate transfer of power. Like Nicholas in 1917, the party could be both the provisional government and Bolsheviks' equivalent in Orwell's 1958. Perhaps the party then might even have forced Elizabeth to first dissolve Parliament and then trigger a general election that the party, of course, would be certain to win. With this endorsement from the people, they could then act more harshly against the Queen, perhaps passing laws that officially dissolve the kingdom and sign a treaty of union or something similar with the former United States. Finally, Elizabeth would be forced to abdicate, and then the nightmare would truly begin. Sadly, I fear both Charles and Anne, her only children at this time, would have been torn away from her at or very soon after capture. Philip's fate for me is intriguing to think about in and of itself. Though historically he retired from active military service in 1951, I find it hard to believe, given his personality, that he would not have played some role in the Empire's defence. If Prince Philip was not already dead at this point, then he would be right after his wife, as arguably the most high-profile royal prisoner, and his trial and execution would be inevitable. The question as to Elizabeth's exact treatment after her political use had run its course is, for me, actually hard to discern. Was the early party still under the collective leadership of men like Goldstein, Jones, Aronson and Rutherford, anything like their latter-day selves? I think it's important to distinguish between the two periods. Though definite details are elusive, we can infer much from what we do have in the book. Goldstein, a very prominent leader, is heard even in his controlled speech at the 2 Minutes Hate, talking about securing peace and upholding freedom of the press, speech and assembly, which, while in this warped world are bad things, to us and most people are good things. Far from being the party of Big Brother at this early stage, I'm not so sure that they would have had the time or even the inclination at this point to have the Fort Police or Mini-Love in place. This is very early on in their reign. Would Comrade Elizabeth Windsor have undergone the ordeal of Mini-Love and Room 101? Well, I doubt it, but perhaps on the other hand, Goldstein and his like were just as cruel and cynical in their lust for pure, absolute power as BB and his inner party would be later on. I doubt this myself though. From what we can tell, this era, the era in which Winston lived and suffered in the book, was the later age of Big Brotherism, which no other leaders had survived to. The last, Jones, Aronson and Rutherford, had been purged in around 1965, so that by 1970, BB was the undisputed master of the party in Oceania. With no rival forces to oppose him or the faction he actually represents, then we can definitely say that the conditions were in place for such treatment. If Elizabeth and her family had faced the party in 1970 or after, or perhaps even around the middle 1960s, then yes, I have little doubt they would have been gladly escorted into the windowless white cells. Even without the ordeal of Room 101, I imagine other threats and blackmailing would be used, perhaps aimed at her children to compel her obedience and cooperation. Verbal abuse, long periods of confinement, perhaps sleep and food deprivation, and just general mild mistreatment, though relatively mild compared to later era thought criminals, would perhaps be more than enough to mould Elizabeth into the desired puppet the original leaders of the party needed to make an example of this chief of the capitalists. If captured alive, I have small doubt that she would be put on very public trial. An interesting and subtle possible nod to the party's anti-monarchism, and that this would have been something they did, is perhaps found in mention of Oliver Cromwell's statue in Victory Square. In a society where the past is constantly rewritten and warped, it's very telling that the party allowed such a prominent historical figure's statue to remain there, and only a little distance from a statue of BB himself. Cromwell, of course, was a major figure in the English Civil Wars period, rising to leadership in the army and then as a chief advocate for the trial and execution of King Charles I, the latter losing his head on January 30th of 1649. Cromwell would afterwards rise to effectively become a king himself, ironically far more powerful than Charles had been, as the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland and Ireland. The parallels for me are striking. Was the party making a direct comparison between Cromwell, a well-known regicide, and BB? BB too could be cast as a protector of sorts. Winston indeed even thinks of him as that, using that very word in the 2 minutes hate scene. Perhaps then BB, or the leaders behind the scenes who actually created him, wanted to align themselves with this historical figure to emphasize their own roles as abolishers of the monarchy and supreme military leaders. This mention of Cromwell and Winston's linking language does superficially seem to hint at such a fate for Elizabeth and her family as the successors of Charles. As for Elizabeth's theorized trial, her responses would be rehearsed and compelled, pre-recorded, and we would very likely see a Winston movie-style confession in which Elizabeth laments her great crimes and treachery. No doubt her crimes would be in proportion to her former status, perhaps collusion with Eurasia and her efforts to overturn the revolution itself and reinstate herself as the queen of slaves. She would be presented as a profoundly ordinary-looking woman, her makeup scrubbed off, wearing simple clothing. Perhaps her eyes would be reddened with weeks, possibly months, of little or no sleep. Once the final acceptance of her guilt had been given, and the verdict rendered by a special tribunal of early inner party members, she would be led away to face her fate. Given my previous point about how the party perhaps have not yet devolved into hanging, drawing and quartering its prisoners, perhaps Elizabeth instead is more cleanly disposed of. I think she would perhaps be hung on a grand gallows, maybe constructed in front of Buckingham Palace itself or some other symbolic place, though the palace is a universal symbol of the British monarchy. Her death would be beamed on telescreens across not only Oceania, but likely Eurasia too, the fall of this last great enemy of the people, who nominally presided over a worldwide empire a once-in-a-century, perhaps even a once-in-a-millennium event if the party endures indefinitely. What of Philip, Margaret, and the children and others then? Perhaps Philip, as a military man, would be shot by firing squad. If still in military service and in arms against the party, perhaps he would be executed more harshly. Regardless of the manner of his execution, I think it would be a fait accompli. Indeed, all the close blood relatives of Elizabeth would soon sadly follow her to the grave. Margaret, as close to the old line of succession, would not long outlive her sister. By the same logic, Prince Charles too, a child at the time, and his sister would also be despicably murdered. Though much like the historic princes in the Tower of Richard III's reign, perhaps they would be done away with behind the scenes, the news being broadcast that counter-revolutionaries had done the deed, or perhaps that they had simply died of illness. Unfortunately, I don't believe any blood royal, adult or child, would or could be permitted to live. Not only are they born class enemies, but it would simply be dangerous to have the Queen or any of her potential heirs live to be a potential focus of domestic unrest or, BB forbid, a counter-revolution. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, party rule would still be in its infancy, and it's likely not everybody would be gushing with support for Ingsoc. Elizabeth, Charles, or someone with a claim to the abolished throne would be a natural figurehead to give any opposition legitimacy, the better then to tear out the roots of such a possibility. In conclusion then, the royals would be ultimately murdered, but not before being extracted for the most political use. The Queen's last months would be ones as the party's mistreated puppet, and then its star arch-criminal. So there we have it, what I believe the fate of Queen Elizabeth II and her family would be in the world of 1984. Add in the wider family too, and indeed the wider nobility and its hangers-on. I think even anybody in service to the royals or nobility, that is the butlers, assistants and all the rest, would suffer similar, if less dramatic and public fates, branded perhaps as class traitors and lackeys. But what do you think? Is there any scenario in which Queen Elizabeth II survives? Given the world is either under the control of the party, the neo-Bolsheviks, or the emerging East Asians, where could she even go aside from the disputed zone? Write your thoughts and objections in the comments section. And remember our boys on the Malabar front. Just think what they have to put up with. And I'll see you next time.